This is a tutorial on how to make a baby Groot cake. I designed this cake so that anybody could make it. He is all frosting and chocolate except for the eyes, which are fondant, but you could also use frosting to make the eyes if you prefer. So I started out by making some sugar cookie dough and tinting it with leaf green and forest green. If you only have leaf green, that's great. You could also buy store-bought sugar cookie dough and tint that green also. Spread it onto a cookie sheet and then bake it and then crumble it up so it looks just like this. This will be used for the moss for the top of Groot. So next, get some black and white candy melts and then either caramel flavored melts or peanut butter flavored melts. The reason I chose these two flavors is because they are close brown to what I felt like Groot was. At first I was only going to use these, either the caramel or the peanut butter melts, but when I melted them down, they were too orange of a brown for what Groot was. He's more of like a grayish brown, so that's why I added the black and white candy melts to make gray so that I could melt some gray down and mix it with the brown, and it turned out to be a much more accurate color and not so bright. So melt the gray and white together, melt the brown, and then mix it until you have the right kind of Groot color. You don't want them too gray, you don't want them too brown. I like to use a reference picture when I'm doing cakes so that I can see exactly what color to make it and kind of exactly what he looks like. So then make the frosting in the same kind of way you made the white chocolate melts. I decided to use peanut butter frosting because I used the peanut butter melts and I had a chocolate cake, so I thought that peanut butter frosting with the chocolate cake would be good. You could also use caramel frosting if you decided to use the caramel candy melts. Just because the caramel and the peanut butter frosting, in the same way that the melts are brown, they also are a nice brown. I did have to add a little bit of brown still to my peanut butter frosting to make it closer to the color of the candy melts, which is what you want. You need it to be the same kind of color so that we can match the chocolate that you made. You could also just get regular vanilla buttercream and tint it brown. Until you get kind of the color that is what shows in this picture here. And then you also need the gray color as well so that you can mix the gray and brown so you don't have too orange of a brown and you have a more tannish, grayish brown for Groot. So this is mixing the brown and gray until you get the right kind of color. And then compare it to your chocolate. They're not going to be the exact same color just because they are two different mediums, but as long as they're kind of the same tone and as close as you can get as possible, it'll be good because we're kind of going to be blending a little bit and shading, and it'll look just great if you get close enough. So next I'm going to be making the bark that goes along the top of Groot's head. I'm doing this in a very traditional bark making way by spreading the melted chocolate we made over some wax paper and then kind of smoothing it out, making it not too thin and not too thick, just about like kind of the thickness that you see here. And then you take another piece of wax paper and place it over the top of the melted chocolate that you've just spread on to the wax paper. Smooth it out and then roll it up just like this. After you've rolled it up, put it in the fridge to set and harden. And then once it's hardened, you can unwrap it and open it up, and you see that you have these bark-like pieces. Mine were too long. You want them to be about 2 to 3 inches tall. And so I just break mine in half, kind of break them up. Each piece is going to be different in size. Some pieces will be small, some pieces will be big. That's what you want, so you have a nice variety. Then what you'll do is take the melted chocolate, just a little bit of it, and put it on the pieces of bark along the tops of them, and then spread in your cookie crumbs. I did some of the chocolate kind of spread down the sides of some of the pieces of bark. Some I put on a lot of cookie crumbs, some I put on a little bit of cookie crumbs, and some pieces of bark I left completely plain. You want a nice variety so that not all of them are the same. Top of Groot's head is really jaggedy and varies quite a bit, so that's kind of what you're looking for. You'll see right here I'm putting the chocolate kind of down the side of this piece of bark, and then just press the cookie crumbs right into that chocolate you have just placed on there, and then let that dry. So now I'm going to be carving the cake. I have a 6-inch round cake here, and Groot's head is tapered at the bottom and at the top. And so I use that piece of parchment paper as a reference for how tapered I need to get the top. And I cut it down to about 5 inches, so it's a little bit smaller than the cake itself. The bottom, I'm using a cardboard round that I put underneath the cake, and I cut that to about 4 inches round because the bottom of the cake is more tapered than the top. And so that way when I'm cutting the bottom of the cake, I just keep cutting until I cut it like an angle until I get to that 4-inch round cardboard piece. You could do this freehand and just kind of taper it at the bottom and then taper it at the top, but I find I always have more success when I use these templates, just so I can make sure to keep the proportions more correct. And just keep cutting and trimming and carving until you get the shape that you like. You want a nice, smooth, kind of angled shape. You don't want the angle to be too sharp. What you're going for is to get those pieces of bark to actually lay flat. You don't want the pieces of bark to taper out, which is what would happen if you didn't kind of taper the top like I am doing. And so see, I measured a little piece of bark against what I had carved just so I could make sure that that piece of bark isn't tapering out and it's laying nice and straight up. And doing a little bit more carving, kind of finishing up. So now I take the frosting and I just start covering the cake in that thick layer of frosting. It's probably better if you do a crumb coat first, so a very thin layer of frosting first to get the crumbs so that they can won't get in your frosting, your last frosting layer. But I skipped that step because I was in a hurry. But this is your final frosting. This is your final look. You're not covering with fondant or anything. And so the good thing about this cake is that it doesn't have to be perfect because we are texturing it. So as you're smoothing it, just make sure you don't get any bald spots. If you do, just add a little bit more frosting and then go back over it. You don't want any cake to show through, but you also want to make sure that you don't put too much frosting on it that you lose your shape. So I'm going back through and kind of really making sure I am getting that tapered edge on the bottom, while at the same time making sure not to take off too much frosting. So just going back and smoothing, and again, doesn't need to be perfect because we are covering it in bark and we'll texture it as well. So now we place the bark at the top of the cake just like that. Kind of layer each piece as you like. It doesn't have to be a certain pattern or anything. I like to put like a couple big pieces together and then a small piece and then another big piece, then a couple small pieces, just kind of alternate until it looks good to you. I kind of hold it up there and see if it will look good and then place it if it does, and just kind of go around the whole cake pressing the chocolate pieces right into the frosting and finishing it up with these last couple of pieces. I also alternate with the parts that have the moss and some that don't, things like that. So now you take a paintbrush that is only used for cake decorating and go over the cake just like I'm doing with vertical strokes. This gives the kind of texture of tree bark, and you'll bring that frosting right up over the chocolate bark pieces so that it blends into the cake better. So it looks a little bit more seamless, like it's all one cohesive piece, just like this. And keep smoothing, kind of go up a little bit more onto the bark. You don't want to completely cover the bark, but just go up so that it looks more cohesive. And I do a lot of little touch-ups here and there to make sure I don't have any gaps or anywhere that looks funny. So then take the rest of your cookie crumb and crumble it up over the top of the cake. I'm not exactly sure what the inside of Groot's head looks like, so I just kind of covered that whole thing with the cookie crumbs. It's nice to have a little texture on your cake when you're eating it anyways, so it's a yummy little extra crumb addition to your cake. And I'm kind of just going through where I see if there's any spots that could need more cookie crumb. Okay, so then we take a piece of fondant, roll it out fairly thick for the eyes, and take a piece of plastic wrap over the top and cut out 2 circles with your circle cutter. I put a plastic wrap over the top when I cut it out just to make a more rounded cut so they're not so sharp, kind of more like eyes. And the size of your circle cutter is going to depend on the size of cake you're making. So I just took all my different circle cutters and put them up to the cake to determine what size I would need. And then once you've cut those out, just start shaping the circles into more of an eye shape by pinching either side into a point. At first I was kind of just doing them in an almond shape, but after I put them onto the cake, they weren't looking quite right. And I looked back at my reference picture and realized that Groot's eyes were more flat on the bottom. And you see here, I'm kind of flattening them at the bottom and trying to bring that point a little bit farther down so they're not so almond shaped. But when I got them up onto the cake, I realized they were not flat enough on the bottom to what I liked. They were kind of looking more like an alien eyes, as you can see right here. So I took them off of the cake and reshaped them, making them flatter on the bottom and more round at the top. Just look at your reference picture for the shape you like. Mine still could have been more flat on the bottom, but I just left them because I figured that they looked a lot better than before, so I just left them as is. Press them into the frosting, and there you go. Next, I took some oil and dipped in a paintbrush to brush the eyes with the oil, just to make them glossy, more like eyes. You don't have to do this step, but it does add another dimension. And then next, take some white food color, dip the bottom of your paintbrush into that white, and add the reflection dots in them. Again, you don't have to do this step unless you want to. You can also pipe the eyes with frosting if you like. Just get some black frosting and a piping bag and pipe in some eyes right there in the shape kind of that you saw me do. So next we are doing the mouth. Take a spoon, that's what I use just because the curve of the spoon matches the curve of Groot's mouth, and just slowly kind of carve away a little mouth, rocking that spoon kind of back and forth. It's a really small spoon, his mouth is pretty little, and so you're not taking away very much out of the cake, but you're just trying to shape it into the shape you like. You could do, he has a really cute frowny face if you want to do him frowning, but I did the smiling one. You can do whatever you want. Take a knife and kind of get into the corners so it can add a little bit more detail, and just slowly carve away until you are happy with the shape of it. Kind of clean it up a little bit and push the cake kind of down into the mouth so that the crumbs are set. Okay, then take some cocoa powder with another paintbrush and just kind of brush your cake with the cocoa powder. This is how we do the shading on Groot, and you want to kind of shade in the areas that would naturally be darker. So underneath, his mouth, under where his chin is. But you can kind of shade wherever you like, just kind of all around his whole face. He's a tree, so the shading doesn't have to be exact. You can just kind of eyeball it and see what you like. And the most important thing you need to remember about this step is to put your cake in the fridge first. The cake needs to be nice and chilled so that you can paint on this cocoa powder and this shading. Otherwise, obviously, it would be a big, huge mess. So stick it in the fridge just until the frosting is nice and set. And so I'm just shading that whole area around, and it gives it some nice dimension. So that is it. If you make this Groot cake, I would love to see it. Post it on Facebook or Instagram. Tag me in the comments. And I'll be doing more tutorials on this YouTube channel, so I would love it if you could like and subscribe. And that way you can be notified of my next cake. I'll always try to do cakes that anybody could make. So thanks for watching.